Okay.
There we go.
Right. The story of the book in Exeter and Devon is probably the first account to cover all aspects of the book history of an English community over such an extended period of time. To judge whether it has been successfully accomplished and whether I was the best person to undertake the task, it might be useful to give a little personal background. Firstly, I'm not a historian, but a lapsed linguist, having read modern languages at university. I developed an interest in the manuscripts of pre-Columbian Mesoamerica in the early 1960s, but it was not until I studied librarianship at Sheffield in 1967 to 8 that I encountered what was then termed historical bibliography, now rebranded as book history, under the influence of the Histoire du Livre of the French Annales school of historiographers. I started my professional career at Guildhall Library in the City of London, which contains an important collection on the history of London and the English provinces, in a heritage hub with a library, archive and art gallery under one roof. I would regularly move from one department to the other to answer an inquiry. While there, I ran a course of 30 lectures for paper B21 of the Library Association professional syllabus. This covered historical bibliography of all countries and all periods. I was also completing my master's thesis on the London book trades, 1775 to 1800, and collecting information on book trade personnel on a nationwide basis from various historical sources. I arrived in Exeter on New Year's Day 1977, naively enthusiastic to transform the unparalleled regional collections which had been built up over more than a century and had recently been brought together when Exeter City lost its library powers to the Devon County Council in 1975. No public catalogue of Exeter's local studies collection had been produced since the destruction of the library book stock and its catalogues in 1942, although mercifully, most of the local collections and the manuscript stock cards had survived the Blitz. A large part of the following 28 years that I was in post until 2005 was devoted to cataloguing the myriad items that made up the collections. As the general library systems are not suitable for a community-based collection, special systems had to be devised, consistent with evolving national and international standards. Alan Brockett's pioneering Devon Union List was published in the year of my arrival in 1977, and with the arrival of digitization in the 1980s, a special database was devised, and the Devon bibliography was published annually in print and later online to continue and expand Alan Brockett's work. Full details of my local studies work for Devon Library Services will be tedious and irrelevant, but for more than a quarter of a century, I wandered through a luxuriant bibliographical forest, and my library work was enhanced by my personal interest in book history. In 1983, a nationwide listing of book trade apprentices from 1710 to 1777 was privately published. In 1985, a nationwide listing of bankrupts in the book trades from 1731 to 1806. In 1987, a concordance of Exeter Cathedral Library's manuscripts listed in 3 inventories from 1070 to 1506. In 1992, a nationwide index of insurance policies from 1775 to 1787. In 1991, a bibliography of Devon newspapers from 1704, published by the British Library. All of these and more were made available on the Devon County Council website as an enhancement to the local studies service. All this work was directed towards 2 main resources. Firstly, a directory of book trade personnel and businesses in Devon, the first draft of which, extending from 1505 to 1855, was published in 1991. The contents of this have been included in the British Book Trade Index, now maintained by the Bodleian Library. Secondly, a register of books printed or published in Devon, the first part of which, covering the period 1505 to 1800, was published in 1989. In preparation for this, I combed the collection shelf by shelf, sending annotated copies of title pages to the English Short Title Catalogue project at the British Library. At the turn of the millennium, I curated an exhibition in the Royal Albert Memorial Museum with the title From Script to Print to Hypertext, which brought together 10 libraries, museums and archives in Exeter to celebrate 2 millennia of Devon's written heritage. Shortly before my retirement, the Etched on Devon's Memory Heritage Lottery project digitised and catalogued some 4,000 topographical prints, and an online database system was acquired to replace the homespun system I had devised. This was adapted for the rest of the West Country Studies Library's collections and other local collections across the county. When I retired in 2005, the Devon Bibliographer was discontinued, and my Exeter working papers were immediately taken off the Devon County Council website, but were reassembled as a personal blog, which has been added to ever since. I've analysed book trade references in the correspondence between the bookseller Richard Lapthorne of London and Richard Coffin of Portledge, Alvington, North Devon, between 1683 and 1697, listed book trade entries nationwide in national directories between 1783 and 1816, examined watermarks in Devon ephemera between 1750 and 1820, compiled listings of Devon election ephemera between 1750 and 1900, and worked on the extensive library of Sabin Baring Gould. I'm running out, dropping behind myself. That's the election ephemera. And that's me working on the extensive library of Sabin Baring Gould, split between Lew Trenchard Manor, University of Exeter, and the Devon Heritage Centre. Above all, I have felt impelled, for reasons that will become apparent later, to revive and bring up to date the Devon bibliography. The above half century of bibliographical endeavour, plus much other research, that there's no time to mention today, has coalesced rather haphazardly into the history of the book in Exeter and Devon. The first draft was prepared in 1999, but was only partially published on the internet at the time. The designation of Exeter as UNESCO City of Literature in 2019 prompted me to update it and then finally publish it myself. The study shows that Exeter has been a literate city for 2 millennia, and over that period, the written word has reached us in a variety of ways, from illuminated manuscripts through printed text to digital media. The book traces the various forms in which we have received the written word, from Celtic coins to the mass media and the internet. It charts the development of booksellers, publishers, libraries, and archives, and how they relate to the authors that create the text, and the community of readers invisibly linked by the shared experience of reading the same book or newspaper. It traces the complex networks that have evolved to facilitate the transmission of text, from scholars corresponding at a distance in medieval times and the Renaissance, to postboys distributing newspapers on horseback in the 18th century, and the World Wide Web at the end of the second millennium. It shows how there is a continuity over time. Printing did not put an end to manuscripts, and the internet has not killed the printed book. Above all, it traces the progressive democratization of the written word from a time when literacy was the preserve of a small, educated elite, to an era when everyone can hold the knowledge of the world in the palm of their hand. The work, as you can see, is structured in chronological divisions, starting around 1300 BC and ending in 2021. And each of these divisions has thematic subdivisions reflecting different aspects of the world of the book at various times. For the first 2,000 years of this period, the evidence for literacy in Devon is tantalizingly sparse. There may have been links with Mycenaean cultures in the late second millennium BC, when syllabic inscriptions have been found on ingots of Cornish tin. But the next evidence of contact, again through the tin trade, is 1,000 years later. Somebody's not muted. Richard Cope.
I think it may be Denny. Is it? Oh, could you mute yourselves, Denny?
Yeah.
You've done it.
Somewhere.
Thank you.
Yes, so the evidence of the voyage of Pythias in the 4th century BC. Celtic coins preceded the Romans in the southwest, but the establishment of the legionary fortress about 55 AD undoubtedly brought with it widespread literacy, although there's only a few surviving inscriptions on pottery, wall plaster, and a single wooden writing tablet. The momentous change from the scroll of the classical world to the codex book is undocumented in the West Country. After the evidence of inscribed standing stones in the post-Roman era, it is the remarkable survival of the correspondence of Boniface and the earliest land charters that suggest that literacy in Saxon times was widespread, certainly amongst clerics. And the Exeter book of Old English poetry is a rare survival of a flourishing literary tradition. For the next 500 years, Exeter Cathedral Library encapsulates the history of the manuscript book in Devon, although there were certainly libraries in other monasteries. The list of some 60 manuscripts donated to the recently established cathedral around 1070 is succeeded by 2 other inventories dated 1327 and 1506, although the growth of the library, through which the growth of the library can be traced. By 1506, it contained almost 400 books chained to 11 desks in a library that had been built in 1412 in the North Cloisters. In addition, there were more than 200 books, chiefly service books and legal texts held outside the library. In parallel with the cathedral library, archives were accumulating, from the start separated from the contents of the library. Surviving record series, both in the cathedral and the corporation, start in the 13th century. There were scholars amongst the clergy, evidence for which includes the inventory of Bishop Walter de Stapleton's library, taken after his murder in 1326, and the ownership inscriptions and marginalia of his successor, John Grandison. There were schools established across Devon, and these demanded textbooks, some of which survived for Devon. And among craftsmen, there must have been literacy, as there is evidence of a cycle of miracle plays, although no scripts survive.
Interesting.
It is fashionable to talk about the printing revolution as if it was immediately transformative, but its spread was slow in peripheral parts of Europe. In the British Isles, it was introduced by William Caxton in 1477. In the first half century, it was almost entirely confined to London, and until the 1530s, the majority of practitioners were aliens. In Devon, the only printing press was in Tavistock Abbey, where only 2 books survive: a translation of the Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius in 1525, which is shown here, and a book of Stannery Law in 1534. The spread of printing to the provinces was hindered by the dissolution of monasteries in the late 1530s and the terms of the Stationers' Company Charter of 1557, which limited printing to the City of London. But printed books did reach Devon, although only half a dozen printed volumes were recorded in the cathedral inventory of 1506. About that time, Exeter's first recorded bookseller, Martin Coffin, had 2 school books printed for him in Rouen, and other items were printed in London for Exeter institutions in the early 16th century. The first Devonian writer to have his work printed was Alexander Berkeley, chaplain of Ottery St. Mary in 1509, when his English translation of Sebastian Brandt's Ship of Fools was produced in London by Richard Pinson, illustrated by 118 lively woodcut illustrations of different types of folly, appropriately headed by the book Fool. The Reformation was when printing came of age, with religious tracts flooding the market in the 1520s after Martin Luther nailed his thesis to the door of the church in Wittenberg. No such flood appeared in Exeter, although the city did acquire its own martyr in 1531, when Thomas Bennet nailed controversial papers to the door of the cathedral. He was burnt at the stake at Livery Dole for his blasphemous ideas. A series of religious manuals and service books were printed in London, and had to be acquired by churches across the diocese. The first broadside ballad relating to the Prayer Book Rebellion was printed in London in 1548. During the reign of Mary, Exeter merchant John Bodley fled to Geneva, where he was instrumental in arranging the printing and distribution of the Geneva Bible under Elizabeth. During Elizabeth's reign, the Exeter book trades became better established, but the inventory of Michael Hart, taken after his death in 1615, shows a stock of some 4,500 volumes. Another bookseller of the period, Thomas Hunt, is represented by fragments of his day book at Blandford Fair in 1603, including Love's Labour 1, the work of Shakespeare that hasn't survived. Exeter's first chamberlain, John Hooker, had several books printed for him in London, some of which he distributed in Exeter as New Year's gifts, including the earliest Exeter map of 1587. Probate inferences begin to indicate the spread of books in Devon households in the 17th century, but there is much disruption during the Civil War, when a proliferation of printed news books gave up-to-the-minute accounts of the changing fortunes of royalists and roundheads. In the 1640s and 1650s, the libraries of the clergy were vulnerable. James Bernard of Walscombe was visited by a company of horse who plundered his goods and sold them before his face, rifled his study also, which was a valuable one, throwing his books about the house and tearing them in a shameful manner. Disruption and war twice brought the printing press briefly to Exeter in the 17th century. The King's printers, Robert Barker and John Bill, set up their presses in September 1645, but were gone early in 1646, surrendering to the parliamentarians in Truro in March that year. William of Orange landed in Brixham on the 5th of November 1688 and entered Exeter on the 9th of November. He probably brought his own printer with him from Holland. The J.B., whose name appears on some imprints, was most likely John Bringhurst, who is known to have been in Holland in 1688. It did not stay for long, as only 3 items bear the date 1689, and no further Exeter printed books are recorded until 1698. Hoskins and others claim that there had been a press in Exeter since 1683, but my book demolishes this claim. One main reason is the Licensing Act of 1662, which limited printing in London to London, Oxford, Cambridge, and later York, and did not lapse until 1695. So books continued to be printed in London for a small, inward-looking Exeter book trade. After the lapse of the Licensing Act in 1695, printing finally spread to Devon on a permanent basis. Plymouth was the first Devon town to receive a printer in 1696, when Daniel Jourdain was paid for printing work by the Corporation of Plymouth, but this does not seem to have resulted in an active press in that part of Devon. In 1698, Samuel Darker came from London to establish the first permanent printing press in the city, taking as partner Samuel Farley. Darker seems to have retained his London business and died there in 1700. Samuel Farley and other members of the Farley dynasty retained their links with Exeter spasmodically until the 1750s, although the family's main centre of operations moved to Bristol in 1713 and continued there until the 1770s. In Exeter, Joseph Bliss, Farley's partner, set up as a rival in 1708, and Exeter bookseller Philip Bishop took over Farley's Exeter business in 1715, although the Farley family returned to Exeter in 1723. The third printing firm in Exeter was established in 1717 by Andrew Bryce, a former apprentice of Joseph Bliss. In 1718, all 3 Exeter printers were summoned to appear before the House of Commons to printing in their newspapers an account of their proceedings, which was illegal until 1771. Andrew Bryce claimed that he had intelligence from newsletters sent to coffee houses at Exeter. This makes it clear that a newspaper was an important source of income for the provincial printer. It would guarantee regular weekly work for his presses, Much of the copy could be obtained from the London prints, and income from advertisements came from both London and Devon. Sam Farley's Exeter Postman was probably the first, perhaps established as early as 1704. Philip Bishop commenced the Exeter Mercury in 1714, Joseph Bliss the Protestant Mercury in 1715, and Andrew Bryce the Postmaster in 1717. Of these, the most enduring was Andrew Bryce's newspaper, which went through a variety of title changes, becoming the Old Exeter Journal in the 1740s and only closing in 1791. Bryce was a colourful figure, a campaigning journalist who took up the cause of prisoners in the 1720s, published the poem Freedom in 1730 when in lockdown to avoid the bailiffs seeking to imprison him for debt, and publishing in 44 monthly parts between 1741 and 1755 the massive Grand Gazetteer, a folio of almost 1,500 pages covering all countries of the known world. When the antiquary William Stukely visited Exeter in 1723, he commented, "Here is a good face of learning too, many booksellers' shops. I saw a printed catalogue of an auction of books to be sold there." He also mentions William Musgrave, the physician and antiquary. "I saw his library, a good collection of books, coins, and other antiquarian suppilex," that's to say paraphernalia. In fact, it looked in the early days of Exeter printing as if Exeter could become an important provincial centre of learning. In 1701, Farley printed John Prince's Dan Munii Orientales Illustres, or the Worthies of Devon, and Ellis Ferriard's An Account of Divers Choice Remarks, based on his extensive travels in Europe and the Middle East. In 1703, Farley published William Musgrave's De Arthritide Symptomatica, the first in a series of medical and antiquarian works by Musgrave, all of them in Latin. And in 1704 appeared Joseph Pitt's A True and Faithful Account of the Religion and Manners of the Mohammedans. But the prospect of a learned press in the southwest of England proved illusory. The big guns with the resources to fund ambitious publications were in London, and a large proportion of local publications were sermons and other religious publications, although the presence of local printers made possible the publication of controversial tracts. Exeter's Wittenberg moment came in 1707, the start of an exchange of pamphlets with such titles as The Plain Truth, Truth Tried, More Plain Truth, A Defence of the Plain Truth, and so on, which dragged on over several years. The main difference was that the conflicts were not between Protestants and Catholics, but between Anglicans and Dissenters. Apart from religious tracts, there was a range of jobbing works available to printers. Printed forms are among the earliest products of local presses, particularly apprenticeship indentures. Apart from the advertisements in newspapers, separate handbills were printed for individual businesses. From the 1750s, playbills survived from Exeter. Engravers produced the first new maps of Exeter since Elizabethan times. Books were announced in newspapers with the heading, "This day is published." Booksellers would publish catalogues, and many books were published by subscription, with subscribers being enticed through newspaper advertisements. The lists of subscribers printed in the books give an interesting insight into the reading public during the 18th century. As the century wore on, book clubs were formed and literary societies where literary and scientific subjects were discussed. Parish libraries had been formed in the 17th century, but in the 18th century, circulating libraries were developed by booksellers where subscribers could borrow rather than purchase books, which remained expensive. One of the earliest of these was set up by Shirley Woolner in 1785, but the best of them was run by the erudite Gilbert Dyer opposite the Guildhall in 1783, described as the choicest and perhaps the most extensive of any in the whole kingdom except the metropolis. The subscription library was different, as here the books were owned by the subscribers rather than the bookseller. The Exeter Library Society, established in 1776, is perhaps the first of these. The spread of printing outside Exeter was slow. Apart from a short period between 1718 and 1725, when William Kent published a newspaper in Plymouth, there was no significant printing in that town until 1758, when Orion Adams began to publish the Plymouth Magazine, the earliest recorded periodical in Devon. Adams was the archetypal itinerant printer, working in Manchester, Chester, Dublin, London, and Birmingham. In Devon, he also appears in Exeter in 1775, the year in which he introduced printing to Totnes. His life was described as a lamentable series of checkered events, but his heart was as light as his pocket, for under all adversities, his temper was cheerful, obliging, and friendly. The first printer in Honiton, Samuel Lott, could not fill all his time with printing, but was also postmaster, land surveyor, bookseller, and stationer. Like many other early printers, he was also a lottery agent. By the end of the century, more than a dozen Devon towns had received the services of a printer. The growth of literacy during the course of the 18th century meant an increased demand for popular literature, and some of the printers and booksellers in smaller towns would have met this demand locally, though examples survive rarely. The West Country Studies Library has an unrivaled collection of provincial execution broadsheets, which would have been sold to the crowds at hangings at Heavitree. Many were cocks or bogus accounts, such as the history of John Gregg, one of the cannibals of Clovelly. There were also more humorous broadsheets, such as the Address of Thanks from the English Virgins of 16, written in verse by the printer Thomas Bryce in 1781, or a dialogue about the hairy man, which passed last Saturday between Goody Goosecap, Gaffer Clodpole, and Farmer Slyfox at Ede near Exeter, also dating from the 1780s. There were almanacs, chapbooks containing verses known as garlands, and broadside ballads, often referring to current events. This popular literature had to be distributed, and there was a crowd of hawkers willing to oblige. Newspapers evolved a more structured network of distribution. The list of towns served by the postman who carried Truman's Exeter Flying Post, printed in the issues of 1772, enables us to reconstruct the routes of a team of about 8 postmen who carried the newspaper to towns in all parts of Devon and Cornwall within 2 days. They could also carry books advertised in the newspaper, coffee, handkerchiefs, and other light goods, and return with payments for the newspaper and for advertisements. Newspapers were expensive because of the stamp duty, and readers were clubbed together to pay for them, pass them round, or consult them in coffee houses. The French Revolution changed the atmosphere in which the book trade operated. There were many who were sympathetic to the ideas of the revolutionaries. Many printers were Freemasons, as were many of the Enlightenment figures in France. In 1791, brother Robert Truman's bookshop was selling Thomas Paine's The Rights of Man, but the excesses of the revolutionaries, leading to the execution of the king, caused much disquiet. In Exeter, the resolutions of the local Friends of the Freedom of the Press were printed in Truman's Exeter Flying Post on the 31st of January, 1793. But Truman had already turned towards the loyalist cause, and he printed details of the meetings of various loyalist and constitutional associations, and also the burnings of Thomas Paine in effigy together with the Rights of Man, which took place across Devon in late 1792 and early 1793. London newspapers are eagerly devoured. In Tiverton, the town clerk Beaviswood was alarmed. He wrote to his MP about the cock Jacobin paper called the Courier, one copy of which went daily to Mr. Smith the surgeon, then Mr. Alia, an alien, then Mr. Follett, the congregational minister, Mr. Quick the druggist, Parson Lee, the undermaster at Blundell School, the next day on to George Dunsford and Mr. Chilcock, a serge maker, who sends it and lends it among the common people to poison the honest countryman. This was written in April 1799, and in July, Parliament passed a bill that ordered that any person owning a printing press, including private persons, should register them with the Clerk of the Peace. There was also a requirement that the printer's name and address appear on all items published. In Devon, the first printer to register was James Chave of Tavistock. One effect of the French Revolution was to close the continent to travellers and help to stimulate the growth of the tourist industry, sort of early version of staycation, I suppose. The histories of Devon, which had circulated in manuscript, since the early 17th century, began to reach print in decent editions at the end of the 18th century. Martin Dunsford's History of Tiverton was published by subscription in 1790, and Richard Polwell's 3-volume History of Devon between 1793 and 1806. The discovery of the picturesque by William Gilpin found a local echo in the landscape artist and portrait painter Thomas Hewitt Williams, whose picturesque excursions of Devonshire appeared in 1801, illustrated by the author's etchings. Local directories began to appear with lists of tradesmen, and the first guidebooks were published, one of the earliest for Devon being the Plymouth Dock Guide in 1792. From 1810, Sidmouth had an especially good series of topographical publications, culminating in the massive panorama print of 1815, 2.7 meters long, with the Marine Library of John Wallace proudly centre stage. The Exeter printer Henry Besley was innovative in the 1840s, cashing on the arrival of railways with his Route Book of Devon in 1884, and a series of handbooks, guides which were illustrated by steel line engraved vignettes, which were produced locally. The idea was taken from London publishers who produced numbered series of engraved vignette views. The most prominent of these was William Frederick Rock, a Barnstable man, who produced some 7,000 views, 260 of them of Devon scenes. He was a major benefactor to his native Barnstable, founding the North Devon Athenaeum, to which he gave a collection of his published views. The number of Exeter book trade businesses grew dramatically during the early 19th century. To take one example, Philip Hedgeland printed Alexander Jenkins' History and Description of the City of Exeter in 1806, and a handbill of about 1815 shows a formidable range of stationery products that he stocked. The 1851 shows 504 individuals connected with the book and allied trades in Exeter and Topsham, 164 of them in the 4 paper mills. The tighter restrictions on the press led to difficulties for Exeter booksellers. James Tucker was imprisoned for selling Cobbett's Political Register in 1819 from his shop, which he named the Black Dwarf, after the radical periodical of that title. But the movement for reform could not be stopped, and radical newspapers in Exeter were in the vanguard. In 1832, the newspaper with the largest circulation was the Exeter and Plymouth Gazette, with a circulation of 1,500. By 1850, the leading radical newspaper, the Western Times, under the editorship of Thomas Latimer, reached a circulation of more than 3,500 copies, fired up by his virulent confrontations with Bishop Philpotts. Latimer had replaced the wooden and metal hand press with a steam press that could print 1,400 copies an hour. The level of stamp duty was reduced and finally abolished in 1855. Newspapers spread in the 19th century from Exeter and Plymouth to Barnstable in 1824, Torquay in 1839, Teignmouth and Tavistock in 1847, Dawlish and Teignmouth in 1850. After the abolition of stamp duty brought prices down, the spread was even more rapid. Official publications grew in number, stimulated by the reorganization of government publishing at the turn of the century, with the initiation of sessional and command papers. And these HMSO publications charted the continuing reforms over the course of the 19th century. The spread of education and the move to self-improvement was fueled by the spread of cheap print and the technical advantages of the 19th century. Bible and tract societies had depots in most towns of any size. Mechanics' institutes were formed in Exeter and other Devon towns from the 1820s, and these had their libraries and reading rooms. The Devon and Exeter Institution was joined by the Exeter Athenaeum in 1834, a place where various learned societies met. There are a number of scholars in the book trades in the early 19th century. One of the most remarkable was the Reverend William Davy at Lustley, who between 1795 and 1807 printed a page at a time, 14 copies of his 26-volume System of Divinity, assisted only by his housekeeper, Mary Hall. The author's copy of this remarkable compilation, with its many afterthoughts pasted on folding strips of paper, is in the West Country Studies Library. In fact, they have 3 copies of the 14 surviving. In Exeter, the bookseller Gilbert Dyer published several learned tomes, including a restoration of the ancient mode of bestowing names in 1805. A generation later, the bookseller Edward Upham was the author of A Concise History of Turkey, A History of Buddhism, and novels on Oriental themes. In the later 19th century, printing technology advanced further, with ever faster steam presses, rotary printing, hot metal composition with the linotype, especially for newspapers, perfection of wood engraving for illustrations, which were printed with the text, and lithography, largely replacing engraving for plates, often in color, and the introduction of half-tone photographic technology at the end of the century. Publishers' casings replaced hand binding. Unfortunately, quality suffered. Early perfect bindings were prone to fall apart, and the wood pulp used particularly for newspapers was highly acidic and soon became brittle. The West Country Studies Library had many examples of this. The content of the volumes was often better than their presentation. The later 19th century saw the rise of scholarly publishing. The establishment of the Public Record Office in 1838 led to an interest in the indexing and calendaring of records. George Oliver transcribed a number of records which were used to produce his histories of Exeter and its bishops. Herbert Reynolds edited several items in the cathedral's collections, and F.C. Hingeston Randolph produced 10 volumes of the Episcopal Registers of the Diocese of Exeter. The first learned journal in Devon was the richly illustrated Transactions of the Exeter Diocesan Architectural Society, started in 1843. And these were followed by the Transactions of the Devonshire Association, established in 1862, Devon and Cornwall Notes and Queries in 1900, and, I need not say, the annual publications of the Devon and Cornwall Record Society in 1905. In Plymouth, there were the Proceedings of the Plymouth Institution from 1865, and also the Transactions of the Torquay Natural History Society from 1909. An important development in the world of the book was Exeter's adoption of the Public Libraries Act in 1869. It was established as part of the Royal Albert Memorial, that cultural Catherine wheel which threw off as sparks the city's museum and art gallery, colleges of art and printing, the University College of the Southwest, now the University of Exeter. The first qualified librarian was Harry Tapley Soper, who served the city from 1902 to 1946. That saw the golden age of Exeter's public library, with Tapley Soper closely involved with historical and educational bodies, running provision for further education, as well as general reference and lending services, although he received some criticism for stating that it is no part of the public library's duty to compete with commercial libraries that provide the latest novels through a low subscription rate. Plymouth and Devonport also ran active public libraries. Torquay's opened in 1907, Barnstaple had the North Devon Athenaeum, a benefaction of William Frederick Rock. Bideford had opened its public library in 1905, like Exeter and Plymouth, a benefaction of Andrew Carnegie. Newton Abbott's magnificent Renaissance-style building opened in 1904 as due to the philanthropy of John Passmore Edwards. Exeter also benefited from the presence between the wars of one of the country's major educational publishers, Wheaton and Sons. They and other publishers had to face the competition of alternative media, radio, sound recording, and cinema. Plymouth and Exeter suffered badly during World War II, both their public libraries being destroyed. Exeter took a long time to recover, as W.G. Hoskins complained. Exeter Central Library new building was only opened in 1965. In the meantime, the University of Exeter, which had moved to the north of the city in the 1940s, built massive research collections in a series of ever larger buildings. The regional studies, it worked with the Devon and Exeter Institution and the Cathedral Library. Exeter College of Art became part of the Polytechnic Southwest, later merging with the University of Plymouth, who closed the Exeter campus. Exeter printers too suffered much destruction in the Blitz, but several whose roots went back to the 19th century survived with varying fortunes, some moving into industrial estates. Besley and Kopp moved to Soughton and concentrated on business stationery. William Pollard also moved to Soughton and has continued very much as a general printer, runs the family business. James Townsend and Sons were acquired by Webtech and moved to Northern Ireland in 2012. Wheaton's continued its educational publishing and for a while became part of Robert Maxwell's business empire with its links to the communist world, printing the speeches of Deng Xiaoping in 1984. After the collapse of Maxwell's empire, Wheaton's went through a complex series of restructurings and changes of ownership, finally closing in 2017. Printers in the region continue to be served by the School of Printing, the Department of Exeter College of Art, which continued as part of Polytechnic Southwest, although the emphasis, of courses shifted from printing to publishing. Many publishers emerged in Devon after the war, few of them of more than regional significance. David and Charles is perhaps best known, publishing in the area of railways and industrial history in Newton Abbot, and now reincarnated in Exeter, publishing in the field of crafts. Webb and Bauer also achieved a national bestseller. The University of Exeter and other academic imprints clustering around the universities have also produced important publications. The Mint Press has done the same for Devon's regional heritage. But as always, the bulk of publications distributed and read in Exeter come from national publishers, largely based in London, but often with international connections. Among booksellers, W.H. Smith's High Street premises opened in 1952, the 371st to be opened by the firm, included a commercial lending library, as did Boots the Chemist. Other chains have included George's, Dillon's, Chapter and Verse, and Waterstones, now facing the competition of online booksellers such as Amazon, although there has been a revival of independent bookshops in recent years. Antiquarian booksellers in Exeter have been rare. Commons survived into the 1960s. Royston Parry opened a Dickens Centenary bookshop and Exeter Rare Books, but the longest surviving antiquarian bookshop is in Topsham. The antiquarian scene is better in centres such as Honiton and Totnes. Provincial booksellers' fairs too avoid Exeter, although in recent years they've favoured Tiverton and Topsham. Newspapers have continued to appear regularly since 1945. In 1998, there were 40 Devon titles, but 28 of these were owned by 4 media conglomerates. There was a surge of free distribution newspapers in the 1980s and 1990s, often with little editorial, the Exeter Leader going so far as to declare itself a news-free zone. They have now been replaced by free distribution lifestyle magazines printed in colour. Online versions are now available, though not always accessible, as it is difficult to penetrate the barrage of publicity. Such freely available literature is the result of continuing technological developments which have led to the increasing democratization of the printed word. The stencil duplicator between the wars and photocopying after have meant that anyone can be a publisher, and an alternative press was enabled in Devon, giving voice to local fascists in the 1930s and an anarchist collective in the 1970s. On a more official level, there has been a burgeoning of report literature from research bodies and planning documentation from local authorities, especially since the Town and Country Planning Act of 1947. In the 1980s, there was even an initiative to market the information held by local authorities through the publisher Devon Books. Microfilming has provided the means of both storing information and making available in multiple copies, archives, and other historical sources. Many files of Devon newspapers, trade directories, and maps are put on film or fiche for the West Country Studies Library, and microfilms of archives such as the National Census, births, deaths, and marriages were available locally. But this was only one step in recent technological advance. Digitization has made accessible not only online catalogues of booksellers such as Amazon and of libraries, but full texts of many of the older printed books and manuscripts relating to Devon. The texts of many theses are available on university websites. In addition, many organizations have long hosted websites with extensive information. A couple of early examples here. So, does this mean the death of the printed book? Who needs access to libraries when, in the age of social media, one can hold the knowledge of the world in the palm of your hand together, of course, with its ignorance, hatred, publicity, false news, conspiracy theories, and other misinformation. The largest part of this story of the book in Devon is informed by the content of the West Country Studies Library. In his recent publication, Burning the Books, A History of Knowledge Under Attack, Bodley's librarian, Richard Ovenden, gives an impassioned plea for local studies libraries in a world where library resources are being increasingly restricted. Libraries and archives help root societies in their cultural and historical identities through preserving the written record of their societies. They have wonderfully rich collections where very rare and obscure materials are acquired, often by donation, and gifted to the local memory institution. This work often goes uncelebrated and is often very poorly funded. My book has been published on the 10th anniversary of one of these attacks on knowledge. Austerity measures in Devon ushered in a restructuring of the library service in 2011. Specialist posts seen as expensive elitist irrelevancies were abolished. This set of library service is the problem of the West Country Studies Library. Existing staff were left in post until the entire collection was shipped out to join the record office in Great Moor House, 3 miles east of the city centre on the Southern Industrial Estate in 2012. The building was then sold off to become premium student accommodation, named the Library Lofts, prices starting at £133 a week in 2021. Meanwhile, the West Country Studies Library had to survive on a resource fund of £1,000 a year and no designated staff. But the West Country Studies Library has become even more remote. In 2014, Devon Heritage Services was transferred from Devon County Council to the care of South West Heritage Trust with headquarters in Taunton. Unlike Devon, Somerset still retained a local studies librarian, so Exeter now receives the services of a librarian 1 day a week. Devon County Council withdrew the online catalogue from its website, and unfortunately, the merger of the Devon and Somerset catalogues has not gone well, the presentation being bibliographically illiterate and access to the web page is lost. Websites lost include the Etched on Devon's Memory project. Since 2015, I've been struggling to reconstitute and develop the Devon bibliography, Etched on Devon's Memory, and other websites. The ignorance with which its abandonment of the region's largest heritage library was undertaken is astounding. Libraries, museums, and archives all operate in the same sector and should work seamlessly together as far as the community is concerned, but their approach is entirely different. Archives are only a small part of a community's information resource, and they essentially look to the past, working mainly with deposited records that normally remain the property of the depositor. Only rarely are documents acquired on the open market. Libraries look to the present and the future, as well as the past, to all aspects of the community, cultural, economic, social, and to the natural environment, particularly important at present with the climate crisis and the effects of pandemics. Librarians have to search out new resources on a daily basis. Much is available free, but local libraries do not have the benefit of legal deposit, so funding far in excess of £1,000 a year is required. Back at the turn of the millennium, the local studies service had resource funding in the region of £10,000 a year. The cut in funding and staffing resources of the West Country Studies Library is in excess of 95%. The results are startling, as this table shows. For the decade 2011 to 2020, the public catalogue records only 50 publications by Devon County Council. Of these, 33 items are bus timetables, largely bought in by myself when visiting, others tourist leaflets similarly acquired. For Exeter City Council, only 10 publications are recorded. A search through the archive catalogue reveals only uncatalogued deposits of modern records, mainly minutes unlikely to contain separate publications. The last decade, so full of change, seems to have gone virtually unrecorded as far as printed publications are concerned. And there are no links in the catalogue to digital versions. In the meantime, the ephemeral printed record of our community proliferates, even during COVID. Who is collecting it? Southwest Heritage Trusts are not to blame for this. They have been handed a poisoned chalice by Devon County Council, who as a library authority are dismally failing to reach the statutory requirements of providing a comprehensive and efficient library service for all persons, whether they live, work or study in the area, quoting from the Act. In fact, so far had the West Country Studies Library slipped below the radar that Devon's largest collection of regional literature did not feature at all in Exeter's successful bid to be designated UNESCO City of Literature. The only publicly available collection of local literature in the centre of the county's cultural capital is half a dozen shelves of lending books in Exeter Central Library. Perhaps Devon County Council should make amends by gently leading this elephant in the room back to the heart of the community that created it and built it up over more than a century to an Exeter Heritage Centre. This could fill one of the many empty premises in the city centre. What's happening to the Royal Clarence Hotel, for example? Perhaps this could be a flagship undertaking for the City of Literature initiative, working with the city, the county, and the university. My book details something of the rich cultural and literary heritage that such a heritage centre will be celebrating. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Can you stop sharing your screen?